Hi, how are you? Tonight's whiskey review is Canadian whiskey. Canadian whiskey sometimes is regarded as kind of lightweight whiskey because historically Canadian whiskey was light in tasting, light in body, and used a lot as mix. So it wasn't always taken seriously. In fact, I recall a whiskey critic writing in the Washington Post a couple of years ago calling Canadian whiskey for the most part brown vodka. Pretty offensive term to say, or phrase, but Canadian whiskey is not necessarily brown vodka. In fact, it can be anything but. Yes, it makes good mix, and yes, some of it is not very good, certainly not designed to be consumed neat. It's supposed to be used as mix. But there is Canadian whiskey that, of course, is very good. And Canadian Club has been making brand extensions beyond their standard Canadian Club bottling that really is best designed as mix. Neat, it's not very good. And one example is their 20-year-old. So this is the Canadian Club 20-year-old whiskey, 40% alcohol by volume, and the price is very reasonable in Canada, about between $45 and $60. Its availability in the UK is kind of sporadic, and I don't know about the US. Now the mash bill on this whiskey is rye, corn, malted barley, and I'm trying to think if there's anything else. That's mostly it. And Canadian Club have a release that 6-year-old, and this is basically the 6-year-old that's been aged for another 14 years, according to a good friend of mine on his website, canadianwhiskey.org. Now, I'm trying to think what else I can tell you about this while I get this open. The closure is not cork. It is some kind of silicone. But what do we care? The bottle is pretty handsome. And 20 years old, age statement for $60. Not going to see that happen with Scotch whiskey. Scotch whiskey, 20-year-old whiskey is going to be $250. And part of the reason for that is the cost of production in Scotland. I think Scotland has higher labor costs. Everything costs more. They also, the grains they use, which is barley, everything, the cost of production is more. Whereas in Canada, one thing Canadians do, they have their distilleries run 24/7, 365 days a year, like never stop. And Scottish distilleries, I think, run a lot, but they're more dependent on their source of water being like a community, like Oban. Oban, the water source is the municipality, and they only get a limited amount of water each year, so which might explain why Oban has a price point that's usually quite high. On the nose, you smell that rye, but it's sweet, and there's some damp air going on. Orange Pekoe tea. It's not offensive, and it's 40% alcohol by volume, so, it's not going to be strong on the nose. The nose is fine, not incredible, but not bad. On the palate, it's initially sweet, and at first you taste rye, accompanied by some spices like nutmeg and other kitchen spices. But mid-palate, it changes. And I just want to take another sip. Like, while it's definitely got a rye entry, mid-palate, it seems to get more kind of a caramel note to it. Maybe not butterscotch, a bit of creme brulee, cocoa, maple syrup. The finish is not short. It's not short like a hotel maid folding laundry just before Oprah comes on at mid-afternoon TV. The finish now is also not as long as Fidel Castro in his heyday doing a UN address that went on for like 6 hours. The finish is kind of medium length, and you're left with Definitely some rye, some oak. There's a little bit of like a ginger spice, and it's good. It's not bad. A little minty spearmint gum note on the finish. Maybe a little bit of black pepper too. For $60, this is really good value. This is a good example of what Canadian whiskey can be. It wouldn't be the best Canadian whiskey. For my Canadian viewers, I probably like Gibson's Finest 18-year-old better, even though it's maybe 2 years younger in age statement. But this is good. But for a 20-year-old whiskey, normally you would think enormous complexity, but you would be thinking Scotch. And Canadian whiskey is different. As a friend of mine said once, you know, Canadian whiskey and Scotch whiskey are very different. Scotch whiskey, in terms of complexity, can be like classical music, whereas Canadian whiskey is like tonal jazz, modal jazz. You know, it's jazz within a certain paradigm or parameters or certain scales, and it doesn't go outside of that. And Canadian whiskey is more that the flavor profile is limited and not as broad as Scotch whiskey. But nevertheless, modal jazz can be good, and this is good. I recommend it. Canadian Club, 20-year-old whiskey. Give it a try. Cheers.